Hey Cheve, what's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ches of Masechta Ayruvin. Daf Ches of Masechta Ayruvin is a very difficult daf. Wait, that probably wasn't a good way to start. Let's start over. Hey, welcome back everybody to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ches of Masechta Ayruvin. Daf Ches of Masechta Ayruvin is an amazing daf. Now, I didn't have a chance to prepare a proper overview for the page because I kind of ran out of time. Now, I did learn the page well and everything's good. I just didn't have the time to do a proper overview preparation. Then I would have been late for my morning meeting. So we're going to kind of jump into it. But let's start out with, let's reorient ourselves with the Mavuis from yesterday. So basically, I guess like a super high level overview, we're talking about Mavuis and all sorts of interesting configurations of them. We're starting off for the first part talking about continuing our discussion from yesterday when you have a Mavui that opens up into this Chatzer that then opens up into a Rishus Harabim. Is it a Mavui Amafulash? That kind of stuff. So I want to discuss this setup over here. Yesterday I kind of explained. So first of all, what are we talking about? So if you look, I'm gonna reference the diagram from 7b1 yesterday with that Chatzer, in the top left corner, you have that Mavui that opens up into the Chatzer. So what do we really have over here? Let's discuss this diagram, and then from the diagram we will move on. So at the bottom, I'm just gonna assume that you're looking at the diagram. So at the bottom, there's the Rishus Harabim. Okay, Main Street. You turn off of Main Street, you're now walking in the Mavui. Now, on either side of the Mavui, you have a Chatzer that you could turn into. Now, that's our Mavui, okay? That's our Mavui. Regular, standard Mavui. Main Street, you turn into the Mavui, you have a Chatzer on your right, you have a Chatzer on your left. Now, this is where my understanding has changed slightly. That this Chatzer that's now behind it is not connected to this Mavui at all. Now, once upon a time, this was a dead-end Chatzer. Mavui. Right? Once upon a time, this was a dead-end Mavui. Once upon a time, you would turn off of Main Street, and you would walk into the Mavui. You'd have a Chatzer on your right, a Chatzer on your left, and then there was a wall straight ahead of you. It was a closed Mavui. It was a Mavui Sasum. Now, on the other side of that back wall of this Mavui was this Chatzer that we are now discussing. There's this Chatzer, and in that Chatzer, there are two houses that open up into it. And then on the other side of that Chatzer is an opening to Rishus Harabim, which is what those two houses in that Chatzer use to get in and out of their Chatzer. So we have two separate things, right? We have, on one side, we have Main Street. You turn out from Main Street into this Mavui. You have a Chatzer on your right, you have a Chatzer on your left. Each one of those Chatzers has houses that open into it. And then if you would have kept on walking, you would hit a wall. Now on the other side of that wall was this other Chatzer with two houses that open into that Chatzer, and then it has their own exit to Rishus Harabim. But then at some point, this wall at the end of the Mavui that was essentially separating the Mavui and the Chatzer that was behind it, at some point this Mavui crumbled. This wall at the end of the Mavui that made it into a dead end crumbled. And now, from the perspective of the Mavui, this Mavui is completely wide open to this Chatzer. And now, you can walk from Rishus Harabim, turn into this Mavui, and there's no longer a wall ahead of you. It's no longer a dead end. You can mamish walk right into the Chatzer that is, behind the Mavui. And then from that Chatzer, you can continue straight through to the other side to Rishus Harabim. That is the configuration that we are talking about right now. Now, one more thing to point out that is interesting and significant, and it's going to come up throughout today's daf, is that there's a difference in perspective from the people in the Mavui and the people in the Chatzer. When you turn off of Main Street and turn into this Mavui, and you're looking straight ahead of you, there's no wall whatsoever. ahead of you. No wall whatsoever is ahead of you. It's just wide open into this chatzer. Now, the opposite, however, if you're in the chatzer, and you're one of the people who lives in one of the homes in that chatzer that's behind the mavui, from there, as you can see in the diagram, there's a meaning from where the mavui goes into the chatzer, it's really just a pesach in this other wall, right? If we're going to use, let's say, the dimensions of the diagram, so the southern wall of the chatzer, there's wall to the left of the mavui, and there's wall to the right of the mavui. The space where the mavui opens up into the chatzer, from the perspective of the chatzer, that's really just a pesach in a larger southern wall of the chatzer. However, if you're walking up the mavui, you don't see the right wall to the right and the wall to the left in the chatzer, i.e. the southern wall of the chatzer is not visible to anybody walking up the mavui. So therefore, there's a difference from the perspective of the mavui and from the perspective of the chatzer. From the perspective of the mavui, there's no wall whatsoever separating between the mavui and the chatzer. From the perspective of somebody standing in the chatzer, where you can walk into the mavui is really just a pesach in a larger wall, in a larger southern wall of the chatzer. So that is what I want to point out, right? That the mavui with its own chatzers is completely distinct than this chatzer that is behind it. They are two separate things, and the people in the chatzer, they would make their own Ayruvin chatzeros, and making their chatzer Rishus HaYachid. And then the people in the mavui with the two chatzers that kind of branch off of the mavui, so the people in those chatzers would make their own Ayruvin chatzeros, and then those two chatzers would make a shitufei mavos together with this mavui to make the mavui into Rishus HaYachid. So then what you now have is you have the mavui, which is one Rishus HaYachid. You have the chatzer behind it, which is another Rishus HaYachid. And the question is, how do these two Rishus HaYachids kind of interact with each other? Okay? So I just wanted to point out the relationship between the mavui and the chatzer that's behind it, from the perspective of being two separate Rishus HaYachids that are connected, that are, have this breach between them. So, with that clarification, let us move on. So we're at the very top of Daf Ches Amud Aleph. So now, originally, meaning at the end of the daf yesterday, we had Rav Shesh's view. Rav Shesh's view is that both the opinion of Rav Yehuda initially, which was when you walk into the mavui, and instead of there being a chatzer behind the mavui, there was this back lot, there was this rechava, which is not a chatzer. So he said you can walk straight through, right? So Rav Yehuda's opinion is that this mavui can be considered like a mavui sasum, and you just need a lechi, right? Now, Rav Sheshes said that could also be according to Rav, right? That Rav can also agree with that. And when Rav says that in the case where the chatzer is behind the mavui, you would not be allowed, it would not be enough to just put a lechi at the beginning of the mavui where it hits Rishus HaRabim. When Rav says that you would not be allowed to just simply put a lechi over there, that was because there was no Ayruvin chatzeros between the chatzer and the mavui, and because there was no Ayruvin chatzeros between the chatzer and the mavui, even if you put up a lechi, you still won't be able to carry in the mavui, and we're going to talk about why. Okay? But Rav said that if there was an Ayruvin chatzeros, so then you would be allowed to carry in the mavui if you put up a lechi. But originally, however, right, that was Rav Sheshes. Originally, however, we wanted to say that it was machlokas between Rav Yehuda, who was talking about the back lot, and Rav, who was talking about the chatzer, and we wanted to say that they argue on two counts. And that is what we're talking about now. The original way that we wanted to assume that Rav Yehuda was quoting his Rebbe Shmuel, and that argued on the opinion of Rav. So, that which we thought initially, bein she'ervu uvein shelo ervu plige, and we're going to explain what this means. That there was a machlokas between that initial statement of Rav Yehuda with the backlot, and Rav, when he has the Chatzer, his statement about the Chatzer, that they argue whether the people in the Chatzer behind the Mavui and the people in the Mavui, whether they made an Eruv so that they would be able to carry between in the Mavui and as well as in the Chatzer. Ben Shelo Ervu, or whether they didn't make an Eruv. There would still be a Machlokas. And we're going to explain what these are. So, Plige be'ervo b'mai, Plige b'shelo ervu b'mai. What was the Machlokas when they made an Eruv? What was the Machlokas when they didn't make an Eruv? So, Plige b'shelo ervu, Plige b'nir mi b'chutz, v'shava mi b'fnim. So, when they didn't make an Eruv, so again, still looking at this diagram from 7b1, okay? So, you have the Chatzer at the back. Now, the Chatzer is, right, assuming that the two houses in the Chatzer made an Eruv Chatzeris, it's a Rishus HaYachid. Okay. Now, you have the Mavui, assuming that the Chatzeris and the Mavui made an Eruv Chatzeris, and then the two Chatzeris made in a Shitufei Mevos in the Mavui, so the Mavui is also a Rishus HaYachid. Okay. Now, you have two Rishus HaYachids. Right? The Chatzer is a Rishus HaYachid, the Mavui is a Rishus HaYachid. If you want to carry between two Rishus HaYachids, you have to make an Eruv if you want to carry between the two. We're talking about where they did not make an Eruv between the two. So, now the question is, so they didn't make an Eruv, now we want to know, are you allowed to carry in the Mavui? Now, there's one more detail over here that we have to point out, and that is, when we're talking about right now where they didn't make an Eruv, we're talking about where there is no breach in the back wall. Okay, so therefore, there is no question about a Mavui Amafulish right now. Okay, the only question is a Machlokas between Rav Yehuda and Rav in terms of when you have this Chatzer that is a Rishus HaYachid, and you have the Mavui that is a Rishus HaYachid, basically two Rishus HaYachids, and you didn't make an Eruv between them, are you allowed to carry in the Mavui? There's no question about Mavui Mefulash because the wall in the Rishus HaYachid, in the Chatzer, has no breach as far as we're concerned right now. The question is simply, two Rishus HaYachids, you didn't make an Eruv. Can you carry in the Mavui? So now, here's where it becomes important, what I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is that there's a difference of perspective between the people walking in the Mavui and the people walking in the Chatzer. From the perspective of the Mavui, well, the Mavui is simply a breach, right? Meaning you're walking through the Mavui, you look ahead, and all you see is that there's no wall ahead of you, and it just opens up into a Chatzer. Now, if that's the case, if you have two Rishus HaYachids that just open one into the other without any kind of wall or anything, well, then you would not be allowed to carry in either one if there was no wall bichlal, right? Now, the difference is, however, from the perspective of the Chatzer, from the perspective of the people in the Chatzer, well, there is a wall, right? As I pointed out earlier, right? From the perspective, while you can't see this from the Mavui when you're walking up the Mavui, but if you're in the Chatzer, you see that there's a whole southern wall of the Chatzer. And that southern wall has wall to the left, it has wall to the right. In the middle is where the Mavui opens up into it. And that's less than 10 amos. So it's just a Pesach. So certainly nobody's gonna question the fact that you're allowed to carry in this Chatzer. There's no question about the fact that you're allowed to carry in this Chatzer, because after all, they made an Eruv Chatzeros. It's a Rishus HaYachid. And there's no reason why they shouldn't be allowed to carry there. The Mavui is just really a Pesach in the southern wall of the Chatzer. There's no opening in the other wall at all, in the northern wall. So everyone agrees that you'll be allowed to carry in the Chatzer. The question is, what about the Mavui? So in this case, Rav is going to say that you're nonetheless allowed to carry in the Mavui. And Rav Yehuda is going to say that you're not allowed to carry in this mavui, right? And we know this from the fact that Rav Yehuda specifically went out of his way to say that we're talking about a back lot, because if it was a right, and that's why you're allowed to carry. But if it was a mavui, you would not. If it was a chatzar, you would not be allowed to carry. But Rav says in this case, you would be allowed to carry in the mavui. And the question is why? The answer is, the answer is based on how you understand the role of these walls that you can't see from the perspective of the mavui. Because the fact of the matter is, while you don't know this when you're walking up the mavui, there is a whole southern wall to that chatzer. And this mavui is really just a pesach in a larger southern wall of this chatzer. And you just can't see it when you're walking up the mavui. So the question is, does the fact that the reality is that this mavui is really just a pesach in a larger wall, can you say that from the perspective of the mavui, even though you can't see that, it doesn't matter, it's fine? The fact of the matter is, it's really just a pesach, and therefore you have two rishus hayachids, the chatzer and the mavui, that are separated by a pesach, which means that while you wouldn't be able to carry between the two, you would be able to carry in each rishus hayachid individually. So you'd be able to carry in the chatzer, you'd be able to carry in the mavui, because they're two rishus hayachids, respectively, and then there's a chatzer between them. So, a pesach between them. So you can carry in each rishus hayachid individually. You just wouldn't be able to carry between them. But if you say that no, we don't take the part that you can't see into account. The fact of the matter is that from the mavui, you don't know that this mavui, when it opens up to the chatzer, that there's actually walls on either end of on either side of the mavui. And therefore, from the perspective of the mavui, it's just a complete breach. There's no wall there at all ahead of you. And we can't take into account the wall to the right and the wall to the left, i.e. the southern wall of the chatzer. We can't take that into account. And therefore, from the perspective of the mavui, there's no wall whatsoever between the mavui and the chatzer. And therefore, you have two rishus hayachids, that there's no separation between them, and you would not be allowed to carry, at least in the mavui. In the chatzer, you'd be allowed to carry, because in the chatzer, it's clear that there's a southern wall, and that this is just a pesach in that southern wall. But from the perspective of the mavui, it's completely breached into this chatzer, and therefore, and therefore you can't carry in the mavui. So that is the machlokas between Rav and Rav Yehuda when it comes to a mavui that opens up into this chatzer when they did not make an eruv. The question is, are you able to carry in that mavui? So the Gemara says, so plige b'shelo ervu, I'm on the third line of Daf Ches, plige b'shelo ervu. So they argue, right, Rav Yehuda and Rav, or, I guess you could say Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, and Rav, argue, b'shelo ervu, when there is no eruv between the mavui and the chatzer. If they made an eruv, well then of course you can carry between the mavui and the chatzer. Assuming that they have a lechi at the beginning of the mavui. They made an eruv, what's the problem? But if they didn't make an eruv, are you allowed to carry in the mavui? So, plige benira mi bachutz v'shava mi b'fnim. So the argument is, like I described, when from the outside you could see that there is a wall. I mean, you can even also, there's another diagram on Daf 8a1 in the art scroll. You could see on the bottom left an example of a wall that, from the outside we can see that there is like this, what looks like a lechi, but it's essentially a wall on the outside. But when you're walking up that mavui, you have no clue that this wall exists on the outside, right? So this is what's called nira mibachutz, that from our perspective, from the outside, we could see that there is a wall on either side of this opening. But v'shav mi b'fnim, but from the inside, when you're walking up the mavui, you have no clue. It's all just flat. Meaning this wall just goes, this 90-degree wall goes flush against the entrance, and you have no clue that this other side, to the right or to the left exists. So in our case of the Chatzer, Nira mi bachutz, is the people in the Chatzer can see that this Mavui is really just an opening in a larger wall, and it's just a Pesach, but from the perspective of the Mavui, it's completely flat, and you have no clue that there are walls on either side, and you have no clue that this Mavui is really just an opening in a larger wall. So Rav is going to say that Nira mi bachutz v'shavim mi b'fnim is significant, and therefore, since this is a considered just a Pesach, so you have two Rosh Hashanah separated by a Pesach, and therefore while you won't be able to carry from one to the other, you can carry in both of them individually. Whereas Rav Yehuda would say, in the name of Shmuel, would argue that no, the fact that it's Nira mi bachutz is irrelevant, and this is Pashit, a breach. There's no wall that exists, and because when you have one Rosh Hashanah and another Rosh Hashanah that are not separated from each other whatsoever, you can't carry, so you wouldn't be allowed to carry in this Mavui because it's a complete breach. Again, in the Chatzer you would be allowed to carry because in the Chatzer it's clear that this opening is really just part of a larger wall, but from the Mavui there is no indication of that. It just looks like the wall is completely gone. Okay. Be'eruv kamiflagei. Now they also argue when there is an Eruv between the two, right? When the Chatzer and the Mavui made an Eruv, and therefore you can carry between the Chatzer and the Mavui, but they still argue. Because in this case, it's talking about where the back wall of the Chatzer has a breach in it, which means that you can enter into the Mavui on one end, walk through the Mavui, through the Chatzer, and now out the back of the Chatzer. So now the question is, even though they made an Eruv, can you carry in this Mavui, since you could now walk straight through and leave on the other side of the Chatzer? So of course Rav Yehuda said that that is no problem. Just like, as long as they have a lechi at the beginning of the Mavui, you can carry in the Mavui. Just like he said with that Rechava, with that back lot, where you don't need to make an Eruv or anything like that. So you can carry in the Mavui. So here also, as long as they made an Eruv, you can carry, whereas clearly Rav was saying that even though they made an Eruv, you would not be allowed to carry because it's a Mavui Mefulash, at least according to the way that we wanted to explain originally, that it was a machlokas between Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel on the one hand, and Rav on the other hand. Right? Be'ervu kamiflagei Rav Yosef. They're arguing about Rav Yosef, the Amr of Yosef. Said Rav Yosef, Lo shanu ele shekale be'emtza rechava. That Rav Yosef says that machlokas between Rav Yehuda, Amr, Shmuel on the one hand, and Rav on the other hand, is when the Mavui enters into this Chatzer, in the middle of the Chatzer, basically as we've been assuming up until now. Right? As we've been assuming up until now. Right? You could see, again, on 7b1, you can see that the Mavui, when it opens up into the Chatzer, it's smack in the middle of the Chatzer. And that is where there's the machlokas between Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, and Rav. However, if you look at 8a1 at the bottom right, you could see that if the Mavui doesn't open up into the middle of, in this case, they're using the back lot, but it would be the same thing if you have a Chatzer that you made an Eruv with. So if it goes, so let's use the back lot because that's what we have in the example. If you walk through the Mavui into the back lot, but it's flush against the right wall of the back lot, or the left wall if you want, it's the same thing, right? But in this case, the right wall. Well, here, since you can walk into the Mavui and go straight through the back lot and out Rosh Hashanah, and there's no indication visually, at least if the Mavui is in the middle of the Chatzer, you can see, it opens up into some other space before it goes to Rosh Hashanah. But if it's flush against one of the wall, let's say the right wall, as in the diagram, well, then it just looks like it's just a regular Mavui Mefulash, that it opens on one side and goes out the other side. So then everyone agrees that you would have to treat it as a Mavui Mefulash, right? The machlokas is when the Mavui opens up into the middle of the Chatzer, like in the diagram on 7b1. So in that case, Rav Yehuda would say it's acceptable, and Rav would say that it's not, right? Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel would say it's acceptable, Rav would say it's not. So again, right, the Amar of Yosef said, Rav Yosef, Lo shanu ele shekale le'emtza rechava. The machlokas between Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, and who else? And Rav is when the Mavui enters into the middle of the Chatzer, aval kala letzidei rechava, but if it would, or in this case the rechava, fine. When it opens up into the rechava, right, the back lot is interchangeable with a chaser that made an eruv with the mavui. So when it opens up to the side of the rechava aser, then it's going to be forbidden. Okay, fine, Seder. Amar Rabba, said Rabba, Hada Amart le'emtza. Okay, I think that we are actually, okay, we're done with that for now. We're done with that for now, right? That was a flashback to the original way that we wanted to say that there was a machlokes between Rav Yudah Amar Shmuel and Rav. In the end, we said that, we can hold like Rav Sheshes, that basically both prices are Rav, and they agree. And basically, as long as you made an eruv between the chaser and the mavui, then you'll be allowed to carry in the mavui, even if it's open on the other end. And we'll treat it like a mavui sasum, as opposed to a mavui mefulash. And that will be whether it's a backlot, whether it's in a chaser that you made an eruv with be seder. Now, Amar Rabba, so now says Rabba, Hada Amar le'emtza rechava mutter. So when we say that when the mavui opens up into the middle of this back lot, so now assuming like Rav Sheshes from this point on, okay? So Rav says that you'd be allowed to carry in the mavui. Lo amaran ela zeh shelo keneged zeh. That is only as long as the mavui does not enter into the chaser, mamish opposite the breach to then go out the other side to Rishus Harabim. Aval zeh keneged zeh aser. But if the mavui entered into the chaser, mamish opposite the breach to then go out the other side to Rishus Harabim, that would not be allowed. Now we could see that example on, so if you look on 8A2, all the way at the bottom left, okay, so there you could see it. The mavui goes into this back lot, and then the exit to Rishus Harabim is on a diagonal from there. Now, I don't know if I keep on interchanging like backlot and chaser. It really is the same thing, right? Backlot is the same thing as a chaser that you made an eruv with, okay? So if you're going up the mavui into this back lot, and then you can go on a diagonal to exit, then that is where we say you can carry in the mavui as long as there's a lechi. However, if the exit to Rishus Harabim is mamish opposite the mavui, as we've been assuming up until now, Rabba is arguing that you would not be allowed to carry in the mavui, because it would just be like a mavui mefulash. You would have to you'd have to treat it like a mavui mefulash, to a Pesach, whatever. Fine. Amar of Misharshia, says Amar of Misharshia, Hada Amar zeh shelo keneged zeh mutter, lo amarin ela berchava derabim, ava berchava deyachid, zimnin demimlach Allah, uvani labatim. Let's read that again. Amar of Misharshia, says of Misharshia, Hada Amar zeh shelo keneged zeh mutter. When we just said, right, Rabba just said, that according to Rav Yosef, who says that as long that if the mavui opens up into the middle of the rechava, right? So then Rav is saying that you'd be allowed to carry in the mavui. So that would only be if the mavui does not enter into the rechava directly opposite the breach to then exit to Rishus Harabim, right? It would have to be on an angle. So it says with Misharsha, even if it is on a diagonal, you still would not be allowed to carry in the mavui. If, right, lo amaran ela rechava derabim, hava rechava deyachid, right? So that's only if it's a rechava derabim. That's only if the rechava is owned by lots of people. Because if the rechava is owned by lots of people, well, then you can assume that it's going to be difficult to make any structural changes to that rechava. However, aval rechava deyachid, if this rechava is owned by one person, zimnin demimlech Allah uvani labatim, well, sometimes he might change his mind and decide, you know what, he wants to do some construction in that rechava, and there's not anybody to stop him. And and then it will end up being like what Rav Yosef described as a mavui that goes along the side wall of the rechava, and that will be aser, right? So let's talk about this for a second, right? If you look at diagram A at the bottom left of 882, so here you see, you walk up the mavui, you get to the rechava, and then the exit to Rishus HaRabim is on the opposite side of the rechava, but off to the right. So that is the example where we said that would be fine. Rav Misharsha points out, though, that this would only be fine if this rechava, if this back area is owned by lots of people. Because as long as it's owned by lots of people, we can assume that nothing's ever going to get done. And if one guy wants to make construction until he gets everybody else's permission, forget about it. So we can rest assured that the physical, whatever dimensions or makeup of this backlot is not going to change. And therefore, this is acceptable. The problem with a backlot that's owned by one person is that he can make his own decisions and he can do construction and change things. And what could then happen is, as you see in diagram B, actually no, not diagram B, rather if you look at to the right of that, right, the bottom of the right column, what you see is in that chutzner on the right, he actually added another house. He did some construction. And what you end up with now is actually the mavui. While initially you had, like in diagram A at the bottom left, which say you walk up the mavui and then you'd have to walk walk through the exit on the other side of the mavui, but you'd have to kind of turn right in order to do that. Well, what happens now is that if this guy does construction, well then the mavui, you can walk straight from the Rishus HaRabim on one side straight to the back lot, and the wall is completely flush. Now, we said that according to Rav Yosef, you can't have the wall be completely flush, and therefore that would be a problem. So Misharsha says that, you can only rely on the, physical construction of the rechava as long as it's owned by a group of people who are going to be so inefficient that we can assume that they will never be able to do construction without getting in a big fight, and it'll stay the same. But if it's owned by one person who can just make his own decisions, well then you would not be allowed to carry in the mavui, because we have to be concerned that maybe he's going to do construction and making the rechava in such a way that you no longer would be able to carry in the mavui. However, you're going to be so accustomed to carrying in the mavui because it was after all allowed before the construction happened. So we're concerned about that, and therefore if the backlot is owned by one person, you won't be able to carry in the mavui, even if currently it's constructed in such a way that arguably would allow you to carry in the mavui. And how do I know that there's a difference between when you have something owned by one person where he can just make decisions and change the physical makeup of the rechava versus when it's owned by lots of people and nothing will ever get done? The Amar Ravin bar Rav Ada Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Ma'aseh b'mavui echad shetzido echad kale liyam. There was a story with a certain mavui that one side of it was the sea, and b'tzido echad kale la'ashba. The other side of it was a garbage heap. Uva ma'aseh lifnei Rebbe v'lo amar ba lo heter v'lo iser. And then this incident came in front of Rebbe, and the fellows there, they were like, "Hey Rebbe, what do we do?" And he didn't say an Isser or a Heter. Let us discuss this for a second. So, if you look at the diagram on 8A3, so on the bottom left, so then you can see this is what we're talking about. You see the Chatzer in the back over there, okay? So there are two Chatzers, each have their houses into it, and then they open up into this interesting mavui. What's interesting about this mavui is that the walls are sort of not your standard walls. One wall of the mavui is actually the sea, that the sea kind of forms like a wall by the edge of it. It has to be steep enough. Actually, as we learned in Masechta Shabbos, that you have to be able to walk. What was it? 10 tefachim high and 4 amas or something like that. Anyways, it has to be steep enough so that it actually constitutes a wall. And on the other side, on the left side, is a big garbage heap that's 10 tefachim tall. So basically you have these two walls, but they're kind of strange walls. And they said, "Hey Rebbe, can we treat this as a regular mavui? Can we carry in this mavui as long as we put up a lechi? And he didn't tell them anything. He didn't say, yeah, sure, you could put up a lechi, but he also didn't say that you're not allowed to put up a lechi. Isr lo amar ba deha kaimim mechitzis. So he didn't say that it's also, because the fact of the matter is you have these walls. You have the sea, and you have the garbage. Heter lo amar ba chashinan shema tinatal ashbe v'yala yam sirton. And he also didn't say that it would be mutter to put up a lechi over there, because after all, he's concerned, what happens if they clear away the garbage one day? So then you're no longer going to have your wall. But then people are going to be so used to carrying in the mavui, because they were carried in the mavui for all these years or whatever, and it's going to cause a problem. So on the one hand, he didn't want to say it's not allowed, because the fact of the matter is that there are the proper walls. On the other hand, he didn't want to say it is allowed, because here you have this garbage wall that can be removed. Or let's say lots of mud and dirt comes up from the sea wall, and now that kind of interferes with the steepness of the wall that was created by the sea, and now it's no longer a proper wall either. So therefore he didn't want to paskin either way. But now the Gemara asks, and this is why it's a proof, are we really concerned? Oh, another siren. Are we really concerned that people are going to take away the garbage? But we learn in a Mishnah, if you have a heap of garbage in Rishus HaRabim that is 10 tfachim tall, okay, and the assumption is that it's also 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim wide, so therefore this garbage heap is its own Rishus HaYachid. Chalon she'al gaba zarkin la b'Shabbos. You're allowed to throw out your garbage from your window into this garbage heap. That sounds like a dream, right? So we see that you're allowed to chuck your garbage out your window into this garbage heap, which obviously means that we're not concerned that it's ever going to be moved away. Because what happens if this garbage heap ever gets cleared out? Well then, the next time you chuck your garbage, it's going to land on the floor of Rishus HaRabim. And that obviously would not be allowed. And therefore, how could it be that we say that you're allowed to chuck garbage out your window into this garbage heap? We wouldn't let you do that unless we knew for sure that this garbage heap is never going to be cleared away. Because if there was any concern that this garbage heap would ever be cleared away, then we wouldn't let you do it, because in that case, then you'd be throwing it into Rishus HaRabim. It would be a problem. So from the fact that you're allowed to throw your garbage out your window into a garbage heap, clearly means that we're not concerned that it's ever going to be cleared away. How can we never be concerned that it's ever going to be cleared away? So clearly there's a difference between a garbage heap that's owned by the public, such as the garbage heap that you're chucking your garbage out of into the garbage heap on Shabbos, that you're allowed to do that because it's owned by the public, and therefore you can assume that this will remain a garbage heap l'dairei dairis. It's going to be a garbage heap for your grandchildren and your great grandchildren. Hachanami shani ben rechava d'rabim l'rechava d'yachid. Sorry, one more point. And therefore, by the case of Rebbe, when he was sort of hesitant to allow people to simply put up a lechi over there and carry it in that mavui, that was talking about a mavui that belongs to a privately owned not a mavui, that's a privately owned garbage heap, and because it's privately owned, this guy could decide whenever he wants that he wants to clear it away, in which case you lose your mavui. So that's why Rebbe was hesitant to allow you to carry in this mavui as long as you put up a lechi. And therefore, so we see that there's a difference between something that's publicly owned versus something that is individually owned. So Hachanami, so here also in our case of this Rechava, that the Mavui opens up into this Rechava, Shani ben Rechava d'Rabim and Rechava d'Yachid. There is a distinction between if this Rechava is owned by many people, in which case nothing will ever get done, and you can assume that the structural integrity of, or whatever, the structural makeup of this Rechava will always remain the same, and therefore as long as the exit of the Rechava is not opposite the end of the Mavui, you would be allowed to carry in the Mavui. However, if the Rechava was owned by one fellow, well, he can always just end up that deciding that he wants to build, do construction and build an extra little house in that Rechava, which will then have the result of making the wall of the Mavui completely flush with the outer wall of this house, in which case, as Rav Yosef said, you would no longer be able to carry in that Mavui. What did the rabbis say in that case when of Rebbe with the garbage on one side and the sea on the other side? Amar Rav Yosef bar Avdimi Tana v'chachamim osrin. So we learned in the Brayso that the chachamim said that it was osr, that you're not allowed to carry in this Mavuis. So we see that the chachamim clearly were, also skeptical of this garbage heap that is individually owned that can be cleared away. Also, they would be equally skeptical of this rechava, that construction can be done to it by this individual who owns it. Amar Rav Nachman halacha k'divrei chachamim. Rav Nachman says that the halacha is like the chachamim. Ikeda amrei, Amar Rav Yosef bar Avdimi, Tana v'chachamim matirin. There are those who say that what Rav Yosef bar Avdimi said is that the chachamim are matir. The chachamim say that you were actually allowed to treat this mavui as a proper mavui, since after all it has the garbage heap on one side, the sea wall on the other side. So they allowed people to carry in this mavui, as long as they put up a lechi. So Amar Rav Nachman, ein halacha k'divrei chachamim, and Rav Nachman said that the halacha is not like the chachamim. Mereimar pasuk le l'sura be'ozle, Amar chashinan shema yayle ayam sirton. Now in Surah, apparently it was on some kind of river, and what Mereimar did in Surah, so there were mavuis that on the one hand they were where is this? Is this, there's a diagram for this? Yeah. So check this out. So in 8A4 at the top left, you could see what the setup was in Surah. Basically, on the northern part of the diagram, you could see that there's a Rosh Hashanah, and then there was a Mavui, and you'd walk through the Mavui. Now on the back, it kind of opened up into this river. Now this river was a wall, right? There was a river wall, right? And therefore it was considered a Mavui Sasum. Merema, however, was concerned that maybe some dirt and soot and silt or whatever would kind of like, make that river wall less steep. So what he did was, as you could see in the diagram, he added nets. He added like kilu walls to the end of the mavui, so that it would certainly be a mavui sasum no matter what happens in terms of the river wall. Okay. Now, Chevra, I just want to point out that this next section, not a very long section, but this next section does not make sense. So I just want you to know that. It's not complicated. It just doesn't make sense. Apparently this is a known bug, and apparently people have some fixes. I did not look into those fixes, so we're just going to live with the bug. Weiter. Mavui akum dehava besura. There was a certain mavui akum in surah, right? Do you remember these? Like mavui akums? It's an L. In this case, it's talking about an L-shaped mavui, right? You can see this on page 8A4. It's the second diagram on the page, on the left column, the bottom diagram. So it's this L-shaped mavui, right? You walk in on the south side, and you walk all the way up northwards, then you make a left and you exit on the west side. Okay? So, mavui akum dava besura. There was a certain L-shaped mavui, really an inverted L, depends where you're looking at it from, but I think you guys get the point. It was an L-shaped mavui that was in surah. Karuch budya osivu be ba'ak mumise. So they took a reed mat, and they took like a mat and they rolled it up and put it in the corner of the L-shaped mavui. So looking at this diagram, so okay, clearly you see the L-shaped mavui. Now, as we learned the other day, in an L-shaped mavui, it's not one long mavui. It's basically two mavuis that converge in the middle at the corner. So now, what happened in this case was that you could see that there's a lechi on the southern side by the opening of the mavui, but there's no lechi on the western side. Basically what happened was, the people in the mavui that goes north-south and opens up on the southern side, so the chatzers in that mavui, they decided that they wanted to be able to carry in the mavui, and they wanted to do things right. Apparently, the people in the houses that open up into the mavui that goes east-west, they didn't care. I mean, they don't have to. You just can't carry in the mavui. So they weren't so concerned. But the people in the north-south mavui, they wanted to be able to carry in the mavui. So this is what they did. So they already had a lechi at the opening, but then what they did was they took a reed and they rolled it up and they put it in the corner of this mavui. Now, you might be thinking, like, where the two mavuis converge. Now, you might be thinking, what the heck were they doing? Nobody said anything about putting reed mats in corners. Like, since when does that make any difference? And you're right, it doesn't make a difference. So, now, Amar Rav Chizda, halo k'Rav v'lo k'Shmuel. So Rav Chizda says, well, okay, this clearly is not like Rav, nor is it like Shmuel. L'Rav, why isn't it like Rav? So remember, what did Rav say about an L-shaped mavui? You have to treat them like two mavui mifulashes, right? And therefore, how do you fix a mavui mifulash? Well, you have a lechi at one end, like they have, but you don't roll up a mat and put it at the other end. That's not what you do. What you do is you make a tzuras ha-pesach. Well, clearly they're not doing that over here, so it's not like Rav. So the Rav de Amar tarasu k'mefulash, right? Rav says that you have to treat these two mavuis like mavui mifulash. Tzuras ha-pesach bai. So you need to put a tzuras ha-pesach there, not just take a mat and roll it up and put it over there. Put it in the corner. The Shmuel, the Amr tarasu kisasum, and according to Shmuel, who says that we treat this mavui like a mavui sasum, and therefore, of course, all you need to do is just put a lechi in the mavui like they already did, and you shouldn't have to do anything more than that. For some reason, the Gemara assumes, doesn't just say that. Instead, they say, Hanimili lechi ma'alya. I would say that when you put a lechi in the corner, which of course you don't need to do, but when you put a lechi in the corner, you have to put a real lechi in the corner. Aval hai kevan dinashiv beizika v'shadile lo klumu. But this, rolled up mat, since if a good wind comes, it'll just blow it away, so it's as if nothing is there. V'naiz beisichta v'chavre chabre. But if he takes a peg and pegs it into the ground so that it's sturdy in the corner, well then it's good. But again, you don't need to do that. I mean, according to Shmuel, it's a mavui sasum. All you need to do is put a lechi at the entrance, and that's that. So it's kind of weird. Yeah, I mean, the art school said that people ask this question, talk about it. I didn't get into it. It was enough just to get shot and go weiter. Let's continue on that train, the pshat and weiter train. Gufa. Amar Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav. We're just gonna now quote once again that brisa from yesterday. Well, not a brisa, it's Rav. So that statement of Rav from yesterday that we've, processed and beaten as much as we possibly can. So we have Amar Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav, said Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba in the name of Rav. Mavui shenifratz bimlo l'chatzer. So you have this mavui that its back wall is completely breached into this chatzer that's behind it. V'nifritza chatzer kinegdo. And now on the other side of this chatzer is another breach that goes into Rosh Hashanah. Chatzer muteres, you're allowed to carry in the chatzer. There's clearly no problem there because it's a chatzer. They did a Ayruvin chatzeris, and the two breaches are just breaches, and they're just pesachs in walls. No problem with that. So, umavui asur, but you wouldn't be allowed to carry in the mavui, and we said that this is talking about where they did not make an eruv. And because they didn't make an eruv between the chatzer and the mavui, so then you're not going to be allowed to carry in the mavui. I know that we mentioned earlier that we had said that according to Rav, you can assume the wall that is outside, right, that is visible from the outside but not from the inside as a wall. That was only according to the original, right, the very top of the page, according to the original way that we wanted to learn. There was a machlokes between Rav and Rav Yehuda about how to relate to this chatzer and mavui. However, now that we accept Rav Shesh's opinion, which is that it's all Rav's opinion, so the case in which you would not be allowed to carry in this mavui is when you did not make a chatzer, an eruv between the chatzer and the mavui. Okay. Amrle Rabba bar Ula l'Rav Bevai bar Abaye. So now Rabba bar Ula says to Rav Bevai bar Abaye. You might, in wherever you're reading, it might say Rav Bivi. That's also acceptable. There is a note on Daf Vav Mud Aleph of Masechta Brachos, the first time where Rav Bevai comes up, that says it's specifically pronounced Bevai. I think the art scroll is actually inconsistent about it. Bevai, what do you want me to tell your friends? If you want to argue, let's talk about it on WhatsApp. I don't know what there is to really argue. Let's go weiter. Rebbe, lo mishnasenu izo. So, Rabba bar Ula said to Rav Bevai bar Abaye, he said, I don't understand, what's the chiddush of Rab? Don't we have a Mishnah that teaches us this? Meaning, what's Rav's chiddush? That you're not allowed to carry in the Mavui? Okay, we know this from a Mishnah. Chatzer Ktana, Shenifritza L'Gdola, Gdola Muteres, Ktana Asura, Mepnei Shehi, Kepischa Shel Gdola. Let's read that again. Chatzer Ktana, Shenifritza L'Gdola. So let's say, there's a diagram of this. You can see it on 8A4 on the right side, okay? So, if you have a Chatzer that, so you have a bigger Chatzer, and then in front of that bigger Chatzer, there's a smaller Chatzer. So, just like in the case of our Chatzer and our Mavui, it's basically the same concept, right? So, you'd be allowed to carry in the bigger Chatzer, because why not? Meaning, it's a Chatzer, there's like a Pesach in the walls, it's no problem. And the assumption is that there's less than 10 amos between the width of the wall, between the and the opening in the wall between the bigger Chatzer and the smaller Chatzer. But if you're in the perspective of the smaller Chatzer, you're in the smaller Chatzer, you're not allowed to carry at all, because from the perspective of the smaller Chatzer, it's just a complete breach between, there's no wall b'chlal between the smaller Chatzer and the bigger Chatzer. So we say that you're allowed to carry in the bigger Chatzer, you're not allowed to carry in the smaller Chatzer. It's basically the same thing as what Rav is saying, that you're allowed to carry in the Chatzer, you're not allowed to carry in the Mavui. So why do I need Rav? I have this Mishnah. So again, Chatzer Ketana Shnivitza L'Gdola. So if you have a small Chatzer that then, breaches into a larger Chatzer, so Gdola Muter, so you're allowed to carry in the larger Chatzer, Uktana Asura, but you're not allowed to carry in the smaller Chatzer. Mipnei Shehi Kepischa Shel Gdola, because it's like the entrance of the Gdola. So Kilu, it's just a Pesach in the wall of the Gdola, so the Gdola can carry, but in the smaller one, it's a complete breach. Amrle, so Rebbe Bar Abai responded, Ime Hasam, if we would bring a proof from there, from the two Chatzers, Hava Amina Hanemile Echadlo Kadar Seba Rabim. So I might think that what that Mishnah is talking about is when there was no entrance into the larger Chatzer, right? So in the diagram, in the art school, there is an entrance, but the Gemara is talking about when there isn't an entrance. So imagine this larger Chatzer where there's no entrance to get into the Chatzer from the Rishus HaRabim. And therefore, I would say, in that case, I can carry in the larger Chatzer because there aren't, there's no foot traffic coming through. But in our case, where the Chatzer on the other side of the Mavi, right, when you have the Mavi that opens up into the Chatzer, and on the other side of the Chatzer is an opening to Rishus HaRabim, so people are going to be walking in that Chatzer. So Ema afilu Chatzer nami. So I might say that you also shouldn't be allowed to carry in, right, that you wouldn't be allowed to carry in the Chatzer, just like you're not allowed to carry in the Mavi, because people are coming through in the Chatzer. So that is what Rav is coming to teach us, that no, the fact of the matter is, that as long as that opening in the Chatzer that goes to Rishus HaRabim is less than 10 amos wide, so it's just a Pesach, and you can carry in the Chatzer. No problem. But one second, this is also a Mishnah. Chatzer Sharabim Nichnasin Labazo, V'yotzin Labazo. Let's say you have a Chatzer. Regular Chatzer. You have two houses that open up into a courtyard. And there's an opening in the wall on either side of the courtyard. And you can come in from Rishus HaRabim on one end and exit on the other end. So, Rishus HaRabim L'Tumah V'Rishus HaYachid L'Shabbos. So we say that regarding Tumah, when it comes to Tumah, there's a nafkamina between Rishus HaYachid and Rishus HaRabim, right? Safek Tumah and Rishus HaRabim is Torah, Safek Tumah and Rishus HaYachid is Tameh, whatever. But there are nafkaminas between Rishus HaYachid and Rishus HaRabim for Tumah, so we say it's considered Rishus HaRabim in terms of Tumah, but Rishus HaYachid the Shabbos. When it comes to Shabbos, we treat this Chatzer as Rishus HaYachid knew, so we see already from this Mishnah that when you have a Chatzer that is open on both sides and people are walking through, as long as the openings are less than 10 amos wide, you can carry in the Chatzer, and it's no problem. So again, why do I need Rav? What Chiddush is he telling us that we don't already know from various Mishnayos? So mehasam hava amina anemile zeh shelo keneged zeh. So if we only had the Mishnah, I might think that you're only allowed to carry in the Chatzer when the entrance, then the two, entrances, when the two Pesachim are not opposite each other. But when you have the two entrances, the two openings in the wall of the Chatzer opposite each other, I might say that you're not allowed to carry in the Chatzer. That's what Rav is teaching us, which is that even when the two openings are opposite each other, you could still carry in the Chatzer. But what about according to Rabba, who says that when you have the two openings opposite each other, asr, then you're not allowed to, right, then you would not be allowed to carry, or at least whatever, then you wouldn't be allowed to carry in the Mavui, and therefore Rav is not talking about when they're opposite each other. So therefore, what's Rav teaching us? He's also teaching us when the entrances are not opposite each other. So what's Rav talking about? He's talking about when the two entrances are not opposite each other. Well, then he's saying the same thing as the Mishnah. So why do I need Rav and the Mishnah to teach me the same thing? So my answer is, if I would only have that Mishnah over there, I might think that when you have this chatzer and you have an entrance on either side of it, and they're not opposite each other, right? So I might think that it's only Rosh Hashanah to the extent that if you throw something in there, you'll be chayav. But I might think that midrabanan you're not going to be allowed to carry there, right? Because we're concerned about too many people coming through. Kamash Malan Rav, that no, you're even allowed to carry in this Rosh Hashanah. That's what Rav is teaching us. So we need Rav. Okay, very good. Itmar, it was stated, Mavui Asu Kinado, sweet. A Mavui that is constructed in a very complex way that it looks like a centipede. You can see this on 8b1. You can see this diagram on 8b1. So as you could see, basically it's a Mavui that is constructed in a way that you have lots of like crooked Mavuis in there. So you could see like on the west side, there's like this big Mavui, this like big Mavui kind of thing, and that goes straight all the way to the end. And then on like the south side, there's 1, 2, 3 Mavuis that kind of go up, and they hit the Mavui at the main Mavui at a 90-degree angle. So what can you do to kind of be able to carry in this Mavui? What you could do is you could construct a simpler Mavui. The Gemara doesn't say that. But maybe it should. Or maybe it shouldn't. Who am I to say? So back in the Gemara. Itmar, it was stated, Mavui ha'asui kinadol, if you have a Mavui that is made like a centipede. Amar Abaye, so it says Abaye, Ositzuras ha'pesach legadol, v'hanach kulo mishtru belechi v'kora. Okay? So it says Abaye, what you do is, you just, as you could actually see in the diagram on 8b1, you just make a tzuras ha'pesach at the entrance to the big Mavui on the western side of the diagram, on the left side of the diagram. And then, by all these 3 smaller Mavuis, you just put up a Korah, or a Lechi, and you could carry in the Mavui. Problem solved. Kind of. Omerle Rava, it says to Rava, Kiman, by saying that all you need to do is basically like put up a Lechi, so then you are holding like Shmuel, right? Kishmuel the Amar Tarasu Kisasim. You're basically holding like Shmuel, right? By all these smaller Mavuis on the south side. So you're just saying, just put up a Lechi, and that's enough. So that means that it's like Shmuel who says that we treat these like a Mavui Sasum. So Lamalei Tzuras HaPesach, but then what's the deal with that big Tzuras HaPesach? If it's a Mavui Sasum, then you don't need the Tzuras HaPesach. Tzuras HaPesach is only like when you say it's a Mavui Mefulash. V'od, another question, what about that Mavui Akum that they had in Arda that we learned about the other day? And they were concerned about Rav, right? Meaning, and the Chiddush is that Narda is actually Shmuel's town. And even in Shmuel's town, they were choshesh for Rav's opinion to say that we should be concerned that it's a Mavui Mefulash. So therefore, if even in Narda, they were concerned for Rav's opinion about it being a Mavui Mefulash, well then, certainly, in this case, so in this case as well, we should assume, we should take into account that it might be a Mavui Mefulash, and therefore it's not enough with just these lechis at the entrance to these smaller Mavuis. Ela Amar Rava, rather says Rava, Osa Tzuras HaPesach L'chulu, L'hai Gisa V'idach Gisa Mishtru B'lechi V'kora. So rather what you do is, you can see this in a diagram on 8b2 at the top left. So you can see that at each of these smaller Mavuis, you're going to have a Lechi on one end and a Tzuras HaPesach on the other, i.e. we're going to treat them each as a Mavui Mefulash, and also by the big Mavui you see as well that there's a Lechi at the entrance, and then, at the back there is that Tzuras HaPesach. So we see that, so Rava's opinion is that we treat it like a Mavui, we treat all these things like a Mavui Mefulash, with a Tzuras HaPesach at one end and a Lechi at the other end. Amr Rav Kahana bar Tachlifa, Mishmei de Rav Kahana bar Minyome, Mishmei de Rav Kahana bar Malkio, Mishmei de Rav Kahana Rabba. V'amila Rav Kahana bar Malkio, Hainu Rav Kahana Rabba. Fine. The text of the Gemara says Rav Kahana Rabbi the Rab, but we know that Rav Kahana was not Rav's teacher, he was Rav's student. Right? So as the Lo Sabach points out, that it doesn't mean Rav's teacher, it means Rav Kahana Rabba, i.e., right, because there were two Rav Kahanas. There was Rav Kahana who was the teacher of Rav Ashi, and there was also Rav Kahana who was the student of Rav. Right? The student of Rav was much older than the teacher of Rav Ashi. Fine. So, great. All these Rav Kahanas said the following. Mavui shetzido echad aroch v'tzido echad katzer. So you can see this example on diagram A, on AB2. So you can see diagram A. So you can see that here's this mavui, and one end is longer than the other end, right? They're not flush against the Rishus Harabim like we've been assuming up until now. One end, goes out into Rishus Harabim more so than the other. Okay. So Mavuis shetzido echad aruch v'tzido echad katzer. So if you have a mavui that one side is longer than the other, pachis me'arba amis maniachis akora ba'alachson. So if the longer side is less than 4 amos longer than the shorter side, i.e. it protrudes, it goes past the shorter side for less than 4 amos. So then what you can do is you could take a korah, as you could see in diagram B. So you take a korah, and you just put it from the one corner to the other corner, and it's on a diagonal, and that's acceptable. Arba amis eno maniach es akora ele keneged akatzer. However, if one of the sides is longer than the other by 4 amis, as you can see in diagram C, so then you wouldn't do the example trick. You would rather just put the korah across the mavui evenly, and that is that. The significance of 4 amos is, I guess, assuming like Abaye, that the depth of a mavui is 4 amos, so that's, by the amount that one is overshooting the other is by a complete mavui's worth, so then you don't use the diagonal korah anymore, it's a separate mavui, and therefore, if you want to be able to carry in the main area of the mavui, you're going to put up a korah where the shorter wall ends, and then it'll just be a straight korah. Rava Amar echad zeh v'echad zeh eno maniach es akora ela keneged akatzer. Now, Rava says that regardless of how much or how little the one side of the mavui overshoots the other side, you are simply going to put a korah at a, perpendicular thing, straight, where the shorter wall ends, like you can see in diagram C. And I will explain to you my rationale, and I will explain to you the rationale of the Kahanas. Ema taima didi, I will explain my reason, which is korah taima mai. How come you have a korah in the first place? How come you have this crossbeam in the first place? What's the point? Mishum heker. The point is that we want you to recognize that you're in a mavui, and that's why you're allowed to carry. Don't carry in Rishus Harabim. Uvalachson lo ave heker. But when you have a mavui that's on a diagonal, like in diagram B, it's not a heker. Why? Because you're going to have people carrying in this awkward space, meaning you're going to be able to carry all the way till the end of the longer wall. But then you're no longer, surrounded by 2 walls in a mavui, and you're going to see other people like, out in Rishus Harabim, you're going to think that you're allowed to carry in Rishus Harabim. So, therefore, you kind of lose the efficacy, I guess, of the korah, of the heker, when it's on on a diagonal, and therefore just make a korah like in diagram C, where it's just straight at the end of the shorter wall. And I will also explain the reason for the Kahanas, who say put it on a diagonal as long as it's less than 4 amis. Korah mishum mai, mishum mechitza. What's the point of a korah? As we saw the other day, that there's another opinion, which is that the point of a korah is not just a heker, it's actually an invisible wall that goes down from the beam to the ground, and it creates like an enclosure for the mavui. And therefore, whether it's on a diagonal or whether it's straight makes no difference. It'll still make that same enclosure, and therefore, as long as the longer wall is less than 4 amos longer, you can still have this enclosure for the mavui. Rav Kahana says, now the younger Rav Kahana, He says, since all the other kahanas seem to be putting in their input, I'll put in my input. Says Rav Kahana, he pulls out Pythagorean's theorem. He says, look, I agree with my kahana brethren that you're allowed to do the diagonal thing. However, only up to, only if the hypotenuse would be less than 10 amas, right? But if the distance between the two corners is going to be more than 10 amas, well then you would have. Then I agree with Rava to just kind of make it at 90-degree angles by the shorter side, and that's basically dependent on the width of the mavui. Right? If the mavui is too wide, I actually did the calculation, and the width of the mavui can be up to, I think, 9.1 amas wide. Any more than that, then a squared plus b squared would yield a higher than 10 amma c squared. They ask a kasha, are you allowed to use the area under the korah? Right? We had mentioned that the other day that there's a machlokas between whether you can, there's machlokas about whether or not you can, carry and use the area under the korah. So, what do you guys think? So, Rav v'Rab Chia v'Rab Yochanan amu mutar l'shtamish tachas hakorah. So, Rav, his uncle Rab Chia, and Rab Yochanan, they all say that you're allowed to use the area under the korah. Shmuel v'Rab Shimon bar Rebbe v'Rab Shimon ben Lakish amu asur l'shtamish tachas hakorah. So, Shmuel and Rab Shimon bar Rebbe and Rish Lakish say that you're not allowed to use the area under the korah. So let's say that this is the machlokas. So let's say that the camp that says that you are allowed to use the area under the korah, they say the korah is all about a heker, about recognizing that you're in a mavui, and therefore even if you're underneath the korah, you could still see that there's a korah, and that's fine. Whereas the camp that says that you're not allowed to use the area under the korah, it's because they say that the point of a korah is that it makes a wall, and not only that the wall comes down from the inner part of the korah, and therefore once you get to the inner part of the korah, it's kilu, there's an imaginary wall there, and outside of that imaginary wall you can't carry anymore. No, both camps agree that the point of a korah is as a heker. Okay. And this is the machlokas between them. That the camp that says that you are not allowed to use the area under the korah, it's because they say that the point of the korah is for the people inside the mavui. And, right, for the people inside the mavui to realize that the reason why you're allowed to carry is because you're inside of the mavui. Don't go outside, don't carry outside of the mavui in Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, for them, it's a good heker until, as long as they're inside the mavui. Once already they're, directly underneath the korah, it's not really a good heker anymore. Better when they're, more inward. Now, the camp that says that you are allowed to use the area under the korah, it's because the point of the korah is for the people in Rosh Hashanah to realize, there's a difference between Rosh Hashanah and the mavui, and that's why these people are allowed to carry in the mavui. So if that's the case, well then the point of the korah is really for the outside people, so you'd be allowed to use the area underneath the korah. Fine. Or if you want to say or both camps actually agree that the point of the korah is as a wall, right? So what's the machlokas? So this is the machlokas. The marsaver chudo apnimi yored v'sosem, u'marsaver chudo achitzon yored v'sosem. That the chevra who say that you're not allowed to use the area under the korah, it's because they say that it's the inner part of the korah that comes down and creates the wall, and therefore if you go underneath the korah, you're on the other side of this imaginary wall. And the other camp assumes that it's the outer part of the korah that goes down to make the wall, and therefore as long as you if you're underneath the korah, you're still within that outer wall, and that is beseder. Amar Rav Chizda kol modim bevein l'chayayim she'aser. Says Rav Chizda, but everybody agrees that if you didn't have a korah but you have a lechi, you wouldn't be allowed to carry in the width of the lechi, because the lechi really can be any width, and therefore if you can carry in that area, you might carry in Rishus HaRabim. Ba'minei Rami Bar Chama me Rav Chizda. Rami Bar Chama asked his father-in-law Rav Chizda, Noatz shtei yiseidis b'shnei kosle mavui mibachutz v'niach korah al gabei ma'u. So now for this, you can look at diagram on 8b3. There's one diagram there. And this diagram, you can see that he sticks 2 pegs in the outer wall of the mavui that's in Rishus HaRabim, and then you put a korah on top of those 2 pegs. So the korah isn't actually in the mavui. The korah is right outside the mavui, and the inner part of the korah is flush against the walls of the mavui. Okay, and it's being supported by these 2 pegs that are pegged into the outer part of the wall. So ba'minei Rami Bar Chama Rav Chizda noat shtei yiseidis b'shnei kosle mavui mibachutz v'niach korah al gabei ma'u. Amrle. So Rav Chizda responded, l'divrei mater aser, l'divrei oser muter. So assuming that the point of the korah is because of a wall, right? And we said that there was a difference between if the wall goes down from the inside or down from the outside part of the korah. So if you said that you're not allowed to use the area under the korah, right, it's because you assume that it's the inner part that the wall is created from. So if that's the case, well then when it comes to the mavui, when it comes to this korah that's kind of like outside, but the inner part of the korah is flush against the wall, well then, even though they said in the first case it would be asr, in this case it would actually be mutter, because you have, the wall is flush against the outside of the mavui. But according to Mandam, we said that you'd be allowed to carry under the korah because it's the outer wall that comes down. Well, in this case, the outer wall coming down means that there's a gap, there's a space between the end of the mavui and where this imaginary wall comes down, so then you wouldn't be allowed to carry in the mavui that way, right? Rava Amar L'divrei Oser Nami Oser Beinan Korah Al Gabe Mavui Vileka. Rava says, even according to Manda Amar, who says that that you would not be allowed to carry under the korah because it's the inner part of the korah that goes down to make the wall, you still would not be allowed to carry in this mavui because we need that the korah should be over the mavui, and here it's not over the mavui, it's just outside the mavui. Chevra, that was a very difficult daf. I'm sure everybody got it, but still, I'm also acknowledging the fact that it was very difficult. I don't have a proper recap to do just because I just ran out of time. I got a daven right now, and I got a meeting in less than 20 minutes. So I got to run a shtickle. Let me know if you have any questions, or maybe just as a recap, just listen to the share on quadruple speed. I'm sure that'll make things easier. Friends, have a great day or night. Peace.